Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this first meeting of the Ad Hoc Business Tax Reform Committee. I'm Paul Krikorian, Chairman of the Ad Hoc Committee, and I'm joined by my colleagues, Councilmember Eric Garcetti, Mitch Englander, Jose Huizar, and Dennis Zine. It's good to be with all of you to begin discussion of this. Well, I shouldn't say begin. This is an issue that we've been discussing for quite some time, and I'm very, very pleased to be able to have the privilege of chairing this ad hoc committee to try to advance the ball forward on very important, critically important issue to the future of the city, which is expanding our economic activity, making the business climate easier to do business in and more affordable in Los Angeles through business tax reform, and I hope a wide range of other vehicles that we need to look at to improve the business climate here in Los Angeles. At the same time, as chair of the Budget and Finance Committee, it's my responsibility to make sure that we do that in a way that preserves city services, and so we have the difficult challenge of balancing our need to reduce cost to business while not negatively impacting our revenue stream at a time that we're facing a $500 million deficit over the course of the next 24 months. So that is the daunting challenge before us, and I know as I look around the room, I see many people who have worked on addressing that challenge with a great deal of effort and volunteer time and advocacy over the course of several years. And before we do anything else, I want to thank all of you for your participation. Certainly the members of BTAC, the business communities representatives who are here, all of our staff for working so hard to try to get us to the point where we're making realistic, sustainable, and meaningful change in our tax policy as it affects businesses. So thank you all very much for all your work, and I'd like to offer my colleagues just a brief opportunity for opening comments before we begin, given the unique nature of this committee. So why don't we start with Mr. Englander, and we'll work right on down. Mr. Englander.
Sure. Thank you very much, and welcome to the resurrection of another business tax reform committee, but this one being very, very different because I think the political will now, particularly under the leadership of the chairman of this committee, is there to move something forward and get the city back on track to be much more competitive and business friendly. And and with his opening comments, I echo those as well, ensuring that we can protect the services of the city. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I think there are I think we've got 3 major initiatives before us, and I'll just go ahead and call for the question.
Well, we have 3 items that I propose for consent.
Okay. Consent?
Sure, he got his speech.
Yeah, Mr. Huizar. Thank you, Mr. Englander.
That's the shortest speech I've ever had Mr. Englander give, so
Absolutely.
thank you. But thank you, and I think, as we know, this is the right time for us to review this in a very intense and concrete manner. In the last 30 years, the population of the city of LA has grown by about 30%, and yet our job growth has declined by about 9%. And it shows that we must do a number of things to create jobs, but at the same time recognizing that business tax reform is just but one of those. But this is the way to go about it, which is you take all of those tools that we have in our toolbox to be able to create jobs and look at it in an intense manner, and this is what this committee is all about. So, Mr. Chairman, I look forward to your leadership to guide us through that, and I think we are going to be in for some good times in terms of finding some real solutions to helping job growth through looking at our tax structure. So thanks.
Very good. Thank you, Mr. Huizar. Mr. Zine.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think it's great that we have the chair of the Budget Committee chairing this, and the diverse group that's here representing various parts of the city to show some positive direction on this. I also want to acknowledge Professor Charles Swenson, University of Southern California, who was obviously an integral part of this. But it's the old piecemeal, where we do a piecemeal here, a piecemeal there, and think that this would solve the problem. We take the car dealers, for example, and Mr. Englander was a paramount leader of that, say we're going to eliminate the grocery receipts tax for car dealers. Well, okay, so we're taking care of car dealers. I don't know if we've had any new established, but we're working on that. But we've got to look at that and spread it wider. And hopefully this committee can take the business environment, instead of seeing these for lease signs along major corridors all over the city of Los Angeles, put businesses back, encourage them to come back. And I know that city of Calabasas does not have a grocery receipts tax. We lost a BMW dealership on Topanga, Bob Smith, that went to Calabasas along the 101 freeway because he doesn't have a grocery receipts tax. Well, we don't have a grocery receipts tax on auto dealers now. He's not going to tear down his place and come back. But we need to somehow encourage him to remain here and give those incentives. At the same time, we can't say, well, we're going to eliminate all these taxes and still provide the services, because that doesn't work. So it's a very delicate balance. But I want to acknowledge that I think the group here is dedicated to try and make this happen for the business environment. The business environment improves. They hire more people, more activities done. In fact, I was at the Hamburger Hamlet for dinner a couple nights, Monday night, and there were like 6 people in this restaurant for dinner. 6 people at the Hamburger Hamlet on Van Nuys Boulevard, which is depressing. And I was looking around, where is everybody? There's nobody there for dinner. And it wasn't like a Super Bowl, because this was after that. So the issue is, how do we work together with the business community to turn this around for the city of Los Angeles? And I think the committee hopefully will come to a successful conclusion. So with that, Mr. Chair, thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Zine. Mr. Garcetti.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you to my colleagues as well. This is the second committee I get a bite at this. We passed out of the Jobs Committee proposal that was put forward by BTAC, and I want to thank them for their diligence and for their patience and for the service that they've put in, because it's been nothing short of extraordinary. Folks who have dug into the details, done a lot of work. It's not for the high pay that they've received, but for the love of the city and a desire to see us be back on top. And this gross receipts tax must be eliminated. It is, we have to be responsible, but we must eliminate it. It is the highest in the county. It is a job killer, and it taxes people even when they lose money. And I think that the work that we did earlier to reduce the business tax by 15% across the board, to take particular industries that have been mentioned here today and to target them, I've had the experience on both ends. I've had companies who said they came to my district because we were able to waive a gross receipts tax, and I've seen them leave because we weren't able to get rid of the gross receipts tax. And I think the evidence has been very clear. Los Angeles can't compete, and we can't win in this county with the highest tax anywhere. And I think we can do this, and we've shown the way to do this responsibly in the past. As reductions have come, business activity increases, and when it's not there, you hold until that does catch up. And BTAC, I think, would have loved to have seen it gone tomorrow. Many of us would like to see it done more quickly, but the responsible way to move forward is before us here today, and I look forward to getting back into some of the details that's rooted in academic study. There's no question this will produce jobs. There's no question this will stimulate economic activity, and there's no question that over time we can pay for this by having a city that slowly doesn't shrink its economic base, and that's what we've had. 165,000 jobs that have left us in the last 30 years. And when the rest of the county has added jobs, we have to ask yourself why. It's not the only factor. There's a lot of things we have to do to make this town more business friendly, but it is an integral factor. And again, I want to thank BTAC for their great work.
Thank you, Mr. Garcetti, and I do thank you also for the tone of that comment as you wrapped up. There is much more that needs to be done. This is one piece of a significantly larger puzzle for how we address the business climate in Los Angeles, how we allow Los Angeles businesses to become more competitive. And I think there is room for reasonable disagreement about what are the most significant factors in influencing siting decisions and expansion decisions and hiring decisions, and what proportion of those decisions is impacted by tax policy, by regulatory policy, and by any one of a number of other concerns that businesses have. And those are some of the discussions that we're going to have, some of the discussions that we'll have with our economists as we go through the course of these hearings. I do want to tell everybody at the outset, we're not going to be voting on any of these proposals today. Part of the charge of this committee is to take the time to be able to actually consider the issues that we've discussed so far in greater depth than we would typically do in a policy committee that deals with a number of agenda items. This is our one and only issue. So we're going to take the time to dig into it, to review it, to figure out how to move forward. So the items that are on today's agenda will be continued to our next hearing, which will be scheduled sometime during the week of February 18th. But I hope to spend the next couple of hours in having a really good substantive discussion on this. I'm going to start with public comment cards. And so if you would like to offer public comment on the issues before us, please fill it out and bring it forward. And I'd like to invite to lead off, I'd like to invite up Gary Tobin of the Los Angeles Area Chamber of Commerce. Mr. Tobin, welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. We are elated that we're beginning this conversation one more time on the gross receipts tax and other ways that we can improve our business climate. There is no issue in terms of taxes that creates more disgust amongst my members and more anger than the gross receipts tax. And Councilmember Garcetti has several examples in his. I remember sitting in your office when you said, well, now I understand it, because I've had specific companies who said if we could do this for the gross receipts tax, we'd be here, and if we can't, we won't. And it doesn't get any more complex than that. Now, we can't do that all the time. There are services that have to be delivered in the city, but we believe that BTAC has brought a very prudent proposal, and we look forward to that discussion beginning today again. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Yegi Keshishan, who will be followed by Will Wright. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Eric Keshishan with the Central City Association. CCA supports the 15-year elimination of the gross receipts tax as outlined in the proposal BTEC presented to the Jobs and Business Development Committee in June 2012. The city's current rates, with its convoluted tax structure and classification system, puts the city of Los Angeles at a disadvantage in attracting, retaining, and growing new jobs. At the same time, the responsibilities of this committee need to be broadened to address a multitude of issues that make it so difficult for the private sector to do business in the city and to attract future investment to the city. The GRT has a negative impact on the business climate, but there are other issues to consider. And unless we broaden the scope of this committee to identify additional areas of reform, they will be left unaddressed. For example, we hear on a regular basis from developers who comment on how difficult it is to get their projects through the bureaucracy and the siloing between city departments. In short, we still need real reform for the real estate industry, and this is a very important revenue-generating industry for the city. Similarly, there are specific hurdles which currently impede the expansion and growth of other key industries, including tourism, hospitality, and entertainment, which this committee should also consider. Before we can formulate a realistic and achievable plan, this committee needs to reach out to the city's key industries to determine what their critical needs are. And CCA would be delighted to help facilitate this discussion because we have a shared interest in seeing new jobs and businesses locate in the city of Los Angeles. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Will Wright, followed by Peter Ruiz. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Thank you for your time. My apologies for dressing as I do when I go to work and not at City Hall. I was called down here rather unexpectedly. So I'm here wearing two hats today. I'm here as a board director of the LA County Business Federation, and we support this initiative. I'm also here as an employee of the American Institute of Architects, and we also support this initiative. I have a couple of things to say. Architects have to pay the pass-through. They have to pay a double taxation. This is an issue that we brought up about 8 years ago. We've been working with you on this, and I'm looking forward to sharing a little more enlightenment of what exactly that means. From the LA County Business Federation's perspective, this is something that we find imperative to restoring the fiscal health of the entire LA region. If the city of LA is not healthy, the county of LA is not healthy, this will attract more business to sustain and operate here in Los Angeles. So thank you for your time, and let's work together on this.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Peter Ruiz, followed by Eric Anthony. And by the way, that's the last card I have, so if you'd like to fill one out, bring it forward, please.
Good
Mr.
afternoon.
Ruiz, welcome.
My name is Peter Ruiz, San Fernando Valley Regional Manager for the Los Angeles County Economic Development Corporation. Also here on behalf of the Valley Economic Alliance. As many of you know, we are in support of the Business Tax Advisory Committee's efforts toward reforming the city's gross receipts taxes with an unemployment rate of 10.2%, exceeding the state of California's unemployment rate of 9.8%, second highest in the nation behind Nevada and Rhode Island at 10. LA is in desperate need of jobs, whether it's had a business unfriendly reputation, perceived or real, and we need to do anything to keep attracting jobs and expanding jobs in LA County and really in the city of LA. Thank you.
Thank you. And as of now, our final public speaker is Eric Anthony. Mr. Anthony, welcome. But if anybody else would like to fill out a card and bring it forward, now's the time to do it.
Good
Welcome.
afternoon. My name is Eric Anthony, here on behalf of the Los Angeles Business Council. We represent over 300 business owners, developers, and stakeholders throughout Los Angeles. We support the goals and objectives of this Business Tax Advisory Committee and would like to continue this dialogue to responsibly reform the gross receipts tax in order to make Los Angeles more competitive in this economic climate. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much. All right. Now, I think to start off, what I'd like to do is put our discussion into a context, and I'd like to invite the CLA up, who will be speaking on behalf of the CLA's office, just to put a historical context into the agenda items that are before us today, how they've progressed to this point, and what we're going to be doing on these items going forward, more or less.
Felipe Chavez with the CLA's office. I'm going to basically provide you with the initial actions that the Jobs Committee took in terms of moving this forward. Back in August of 2011, at the request of a motion by Krikorian Hahn, Professor Charles Swenson prepared their study, which included 8 different proposals. One of those proposals was the complete elimination of the business tax. Subsequent to that, BTAC presented a report which consisted of a 4-year phase out of the tax. The committee also instructed the CLA and the CAO to basically analyze this report. The report included different alternatives and provided some recommendations for the committee. Subsequent to that, BTAC made some updates to their report and requested Blue Sky to analyze the 4-year phase out. I can get a little bit more specific, or we can have them provide more details, but basically they were also requested to analyze previous business tax incentives, which consisted of approximately $135 million. Subsequent to that, in April of 2012, BTAC provided an updated report which consisted of a 15-year phase-out plan. And I can provide more details as well, or they can do that as well. There were other reports provided by Blue Sky and also the Milken Institute. The last action that the Jobs Committee took on this was basically it was a recommendation to move forward with a 5-year elimination plan of the business tax. The Jobs Committee at that point had 2 different. They had a majority report and a minority report. The minority report basically was recommending that the CAO, that the council establish a policy that direct revenue loss from any business tax reform is to be financed with budget reductions or new revenue sources until there is direct experience that any projected makeup revenue is real.
Thank you. Mr. Wickham, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, that's the most current history. I could go back to '98 if you like.
Not necessary, I don't think.
So there's, I think the the big substantive change that is important to note was, I think it was 2003, 2004, around in there, when there was a 15% reduction in the tax rates that was adopted by council. There was a significant increase in the small business tax exemption. It had been very low. It was raised to $100,000. So businesses earning $100,000 or less were exempt as a result of that action. That eliminated the tax on something like 64% of the businesses in the city. So that was a significant change that was adopted at that point. And that particular, because at that point the business tax structure was extremely complicated. And by that simple change in moving the small business exemption to $100,000, that allowed the system to consolidate those tax rates from something like 75 down to 9 classifications. So there were a number of structural adjustments that were made in the early 2000s that were really helpful in simplifying the system down to where we are currently. There were a number of other smaller adjustments and changes that were made over the course of time relating to, again, structural elements in the system. But that got us up to the current effort to make additional changes that you're considering now.
Okay, thank you. All right, with that context, I'd like to invite Chairman Greif to come forward and to introduce, if you would, please, the other members of BTAC, and then if you'd like to go ahead and begin a presentation on the current proposal that BTAC has before us.
We get 2 more chairs here for the other.
Sure.
I'd like all 5 members to be present.
Thank you, Chairman.
Welcome.
You gotta stop getting like this.
It's like a 5-on-5.
You guys can be the Clippers.
I can hand this across. Well, let's do that. 6 there in case Mr. Buscaino arrives. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
So I'm flanked on my left, far left, by Vice Chairman Craig Morris. On his right is Mike Manor. On my right is Kathy Falk. And on her right is Mel Cohn. So this constitutes 5 of the 8 members of BTAC, and we're pleased that this committee has been formed and you've invited us to present this afternoon. So thank you very much. We think nothing, frankly, is more important to the city of LA right now than addressing the sizable unemployment the city faces, and this business tax, in fact, is a job killer. And we feel that the city takes aggressive action here and assertive action here to change what has been in place now for 77 years, which is the gross receipts tax, which dates back to 1936, that will send a very clear message, clear economic enhancing message that the city is open for business. Right now, the city has the unfortunate situation of having the highest business tax virtually of any other major metropolitan city coast to coast, and here in the LA County region where you have 88 cities, and we have the distinction of having the highest business tax. It happens to be a gross receipts tax, which has proven to be, I think, rather counterproductive. So I'm going to blow through this presentation. I believe you've already seen it, but I'm going to take you through it point by point. This, by the way, this dates back to August of last year, so some of the statistics have not been updated. We certainly would be happy to do that, but just bear that in mind. This is a document fixed in time as of August 2nd, when it was voted on and approved by the Business Tax Advisory Committee at that time and pushed forward to Jobs Committee. So the first page talks about the high unemployment in the city. And the unemployment, those statistics, again, would need to be updated, but the unemployment is clearly higher than what it is for the state of California. It is clearly higher than what it is for the United States of America. And that unemployment is double digit. That unemployment that is double digit, we think, is actually probably understated by what would be underemployment, which includes people that are no longer seeking employment, or frankly, they're working part-time but would prefer full-time. On page 3, this is a statistic that actually Councilmember Huizar just quoted, and he was quite right. If you look at, this is information from the Southern California Association of Governments, but it shows that something's clearly broken in the city of LA versus the rest of the county, because in the last 30 years, this is again a 30-year statistic, which I think by itself speaks volumes. It covers the period 1980 to 2010. It indicates that the population grew in the city of LA by 28%, and yet during that period of time, the city actually lost 9% of its employment, whereas the rest of LA County grew by 33%, 34%, and actually gained employment by 17%. So what's wrong with this? What's broken? What's the problem? We think the problem is the business tax. We don't think it's that the city of LA is in itself doesn't have the features that would make it competitive amongst the other cities in the county. We've got a city-owned utility, we've got the airport, we've got the ports, we've got great research universities, so all of these things are assets. But what you're looking at is really we're competing for the same businesses these other cities are competing for. Those businesses serve effectively the same population because of the city's boundaries. The city's boundaries, as you know, are quite eclectic. It's a strange city, to say the least, in terms of how those boundaries work, which means that we have a lot of competing jurisdictions that don't have a business tax or have a much lower business tax, and yet those businesses can form right across the border and serve the same population with the same services, but not paying this hidden cost of doing business. I'm on page 5. BTAC's been in place now since 2009. I shudder to say that we're in our 4th year. Entered our 4th year when we passed January. And what we've been studying is the exact issue that we're now talking about this afternoon. And if you look on page 5, it basically indicates that this business tax here in the city of LA is roughly 10 times the average for the other 87 cities in the county. And it quotes other statistics, including the fact that a number of realtors have advised us that and tax advisors, other professionals, when they're consulted by businesses seeking to locate in Southern California in the greater Los Angeles area, they're basically telling their clients, don't come to LA, because there is a hidden charge associated with being in the city of LA, and it's the gross receipts tax. And if you are located in another jurisdiction, you will not have that cost. So page 6 lays out, looking at the highest category, which is professions and occupations, which is a catch-all in the city of LA. You can see how that compares to other cities in LA County. These are the top 15 highest tax jurisdictions in LA County. And as you can see, with the exception of Santa Monica, we tower above everybody else. And in the case of Santa Monica, just to put that in perspective, our bracket is a catch-all, so it applies to roughly 43% of our taxpayers, whereas in the city of Santa Monica, it's less than 10% of their taxpayers. It truly only applies to their accountants, attorneys, and doctors, whereas here, professions and occupations is basically anything that's not classified elsewhere gets tossed into this highest bracket. And you'll see later in our presentation that there has been bracket creep. And what I mean by that is there's been more businesses that have been classified in the highest bracket, which is bracket 9, than the rate of classification of businesses in the other 8 brackets. It's been growing at roughly double the rate. You say, why is that? Well, I would say there's 2 reasons why that is. One is the nature of the economy here in Los Angeles, which is very much a service-oriented economy. That's where the service companies are ending up. So you're really taxing the heart of the economy here in Southern California with the highest tax rate. And number 2, I think, frankly, the Department of Finance is a revenue-generating department. And what better way to generate revenue than to put companies into the highest tax-paying bracket? If you look at page 7, this is a comparison of Los Angeles to the 15 largest cities in the country, and you can see again how high our rate stacks up compared to these other cities. Page 8 looks at a handful of other cities that aren't necessarily the highest, but certainly would be ones that are recognizable. The point is, we're not just competing with the other 87 cities in LA County. We are competing nationwide because of the fact that we're talking about companies that prefer to locate in major metros. And if they're locating in a major metro, we're giving them a very easy reason not to come to Los Angeles. Page 9 talks about what I said earlier, which is the business tax, the gross receipts tax dates to 1936. Yes.
Sorry to interrupt you, but just on this one chart on page 7 with comparison to the other 15
Page 7?
cities. Yeah. Obviously, every city has a whole portfolio of different kinds of taxes, and so it's difficult to compare apples to apples. But New York has a municipal income tax, as I understand it. And I don't know, does that apply to businesses, or is it only to individuals? Does anybody know? To both businesses and individuals? Okay. Okay, thank you.
By the way, please interrupt me with any other questions you might have as I go, because I tend to be a motor mouth, so I'll just keep rolling until you derail me. So by all means, have at me.
Admitting you have the problem. We're trying to get Design admitted to.
Yeah, Mr. Zion's on a 12-step program for that.
I got it.
Mr. Englander.
Since you're opening the floodgate to questions.
Sorry.
Just one in particular, and I think you made a good point, is do you have any information compared on these cities that have those other types of tax structures and how that would equate to measuring up in these?
So these other cities tax based on number of employees that are employed within the city limits. They tax on square footage that's leased within the city limits. It makes it extremely difficult to make a comparison. But I think, and I have, sitting at the table on the far wings, I have two state and local taxation experts. Craig Morris is with KPMG, and Mel is with his own, Mel Cohn is with his own firm, so maybe they can talk about the comparisons between the two.
Well, I'll give them the microphone just because people listen on Squawk Box here.
Matt.
We can probably pass you.
Yeah, specifically to New York, it is an income tax, and so it is a percentage of income, and I know that it was mentioned earlier that the LA city business tax is based on gross receipts, so you can actually be losing money and still be subject to the tax. That would not happen in New York. As far as a comparison of equal revenues, I don't think we've got all of that, but really probably the most significant one would be New York City, which is really kind of a different city on the East Coast, and it is an income-based tax based on, like I said, net income. Most of the others, will have something, maybe some fees, licenses, that kind of stuff. But I don't think it's still to the extent that the city of Los Angeles has.
There's also a significant percentage of of cities in LA County that don't have a business tax whatsoever.
Yeah,
Right.
That's correct.
And we have 3 mics now, so Mr. Greif, you might pass that one down to Mr. Cohn, then everybody.
So the question would be, if you look at Los Angeles on page 8, where it has
Page 8.
507,
Yes.
gross receipts trade, and then you look down the list of major cities across America, and we're way above.
Yes, we are.
They've got police and fire and all the other services. Somehow, they're funding those services. How
Yes,
they
they
funding
are.
those services if we're using whatever we could come up with to supply the funds for the service? What is the criteria that they're using to supply services?
So if you go later in our presentation, we talk about the composition of the general fund that the city has, which isn't just business tax, although business tax makes up roughly 10% of the general fund. So there are property tax revenues, there are sales tax revenues, there are permits, license, and fees revenues, there are a variety of other forms of revenue to a city to fund its general services.
Enough to sustain, because I think 20% of our general fund is property tax. So if 20% is property tax, and we've got this massive city with 4 million people, I'm just looking at, they've got to pay for it somehow. And comparing Los Angeles to New York, it's an expensive place. Los Angeles to San Francisco, I mean, you're not going to get something for nothing. And what do we come up with a formula that encourage business to invest and to thrive and to have the employee base at the same time have the city with the funds to provide the services? Because we're always struggling, we're going to cut back here, we're going to cut back here, we're making changes here. It's like we keep on squeezing that balloon. Does anyone have do you have the magic formula for us?
We think we do. We think if you reduce and then ultimately eliminate the business tax, you will attract businesses to locate here, businesses to stay here, and businesses to expand here, all of which creates jobs, all of which creates demand for real estate, whether it be residential real estate or commercial real estate, which of course then gets reflected in higher values for that real estate, which gets reflected in higher property taxes for that real estate. Sales tax revenues. The connection is increasing level of economic activity. If you increase the level of economic activity, you will increase a variety of other sources of revenue for the city. And the study that Milken performed, which was reviewing the work that was done by Dr. Charles Swenson of the University of Southern California and by Blue Sky, came out in favor of business tax reform and in favor of our recommendation. What was significant about what Milken did is they weren't paid a cent for doing that. They did it totally on a pro bono basis, whereas both Blue Sky and Dr. Swenson, in fact, were hired by the city to perform their work. Blue Sky said, in fact, you will increase that level of economic activity, not to the same degree that Dr. Swenson did, but there's tons of research out there that's been done on a state and local taxation basis that says there's a direct connection. This is not rocket science. That there's a direct connection between the level of taxation and the level of economic activity. And the view here clearly is, and we're saying, and we do have controls based in our recommendation that says if it turns out we're wrong, then you cease those reductions after 3 years initially. But we know we're not wrong. We're confident we're not wrong, based on the economic research that we've reviewed, based on the analysis that we've been provided, that there will be, if you build a field, the players will come.
I just have one final. While we're talking about taxes,
Yes.
where is your group on Measure A? The 5 cents?
If I may, Mr. Zine,
But
that's
BTAC
really not.
wasn't asked to review that,
Yeah,
so
and
we
it's
have
really
no,
not even
BTAC
on
has
our
no view on
I'd
that.
rather not
I
delve
don't want
into
to put
that.
you on a
right now.
hot seat, but that was
So-
If I could, yeah, go ahead.
Mr.
Wait,
Ruiz,
I don't want to jump the gun here, but your recommendation to eliminate the gross receipts tax, why not just lower it to some level? Some other cities, they have a lot of them don't have a gross receipts tax, but some of them have probably half of what we have. There's several cities that have about half of what we have, so why not just lower it?
Members, if I can, and I'm sorry, Mr. Weezer, but I think Mr. Greif is going to actually touch on that
I am.
in the presentation. So
I am.
I shouldn't have done that. You're right, Mr. Greif. Yeah, I opened the floodgates. I knew I shouldn't have. Why don't we go ahead and let you conclude your presentation, then, because I think you're going to pick up on a lot of the questions that we have. So,
And that is correct. I will address that, because we're not talking about eliminating overnight. Absolutely not. Page 9, again, talks about this dating back 77 years to 1936. Let's face it, the economy has changed quite a bit since then. There are no statistics that date back then. The earliest statistics we could find were LA EDC statistics relating to the county, not to the city. But you can see the makeup in 1949 of the businesses in LA County then versus today, which is this statistic is 2011. There's now a 2012 statistic, but we have not updated our report. The big notation is that manufacturing back then was 30%. Today, it's less than 10%. Services were 15%. Today, services are 53%. Why is that relevant? If you go to page 10, it's relevant because services are what are being taxed the most currently, and that is why if you're effectively putting the most egregious level of taxation on the employment you do have in this city, you will in fact chase it out of the city.
Just a quick question. You made a point earlier to say that you could easily update some of this data. Is that if it would, I think it would be interesting to see, for example, in government here in 1949, the percentage was 12.6. 2011, it's 15, but in the city of LA, being one of the largest governmental employees, I think we've eliminated about 5,000 in jobs since this chart was created. It would be interesting to see a lot of these numbers updated, but I don't know how difficult or time.
It wouldn't be difficult. I could go through this and update this and have this to the committee before your next meeting.
wow,
Fantastic.
thank you.
Be happy to do it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Page 10, we've just talked about that. We talked about the fact that manufacturing base, I mean, you look at this tax structure, and the tax structure clearly was meant for a different economy than what you have today. Because I don't think you'd be taxing your primary source of employment as high as you are consciously. Page 11 is what I spoke about earlier, which is that, guess what, we've had bracket creep, the 9.5% compound annual growth rate in number of accounts that have been thrown into Class 9, which is the .507 class, is more than double the rate of growth between 2004 and 2011 for all the other classes. Why is this relevant? It's relevant because, again, you're putting the most, you're effectively taking taxpayer, you're building the reputation of being job unfriendly and business unfriendly by putting the vast preponderance of your taxpayers into the highest bracket. This is counterproductive to having taxpayers to begin with. If you go to page 12, I'm actually going to skip page 12. I don't think it's important. It just says business tax should not be an impediment to attracting and retaining service companies, and that's the point I've already made. Page 13 is tying revenues to the city to other streams. And it says, look, you have more, and it's effectively saying you reduce business taxes, you increase the number of businesses. That will in turn increase other revenue streams. So more businesses equal greater demand for commercial properties, higher prices, higher property tax receipts. More businesses, more employees, greater demand for residential properties, again, higher property tax receipts. More businesses and more employees is greater purchasing power, higher sales tax receipts, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We're also saying by effectively, particularly in the first 5 years, affecting the relief we're talking about will be a hand-in-glove fit with the intellectual human capital generated by LA County's 120 accredited colleges and universities. That's the intellectual capital you want to have stay in this region, not leave this region because of the tax rates that are driving jobs out of the region. We want to, you talk about, Silicon Beach. Yes, we want to have Silicon Beach. We want to have those, that entrepreneurship and that high technology focused here. There's a center that I'm associated with at USC that bears my name that's all about entrepreneurship and fostering entrepreneurship in the region, and I can't tell you how many of the graduates pick up stakes and leave town after they graduate. We don't want them, we want them to be forming their businesses here, and we want them to stay here and want them employing people here. The next few pages just talk about who BTAC is. I'm going to skip all that. I think you know who we are. I'm going to jump all the way to page 20. Page 20 talks about what we see as being the goals of business tax code reform, which is job creation, simplifying the tax code. It is still, and I recognize what CLA said is correct, it is much simpler today than it was at the beginning of last decade. That being said, it is still a complex Byzantine structure that we have here in the city, and you'll see that when you look at what consists of each one of these classifications. We think it'll increase compliance, foster transparency, increase the tax base, et cetera, et cetera. If you go to page 21, again, the same point. What we're talking about is bringing the tax code for the city of LA into alignment with the reality of the 21st century highly mobile, service-based economy versus the manufacturing economy, which was what it was the case 77 years ago. And we do see that the job growth will lead to this. It's all about economic expansion. Page 22 makes the point of also improving the quality of life in the city of LA, which we think is important for all residents of the city. So it's not a question of being business unfriendly, it's worker unfriendly. And we're talking about, let's say, businesses are creators of private sector jobs, they're also the creators of public sector jobs based on the revenues that they generate, which accrete to the coffers of the city. These direct and indirect and induced jobs generate local and state tax revenues that support LA's social programs and the quality of life. So we're talking about the business tax being so burdensome that it's worker, city, and quality of life unfriendly as well. And you're also talking about if you drive businesses out of here, and we know how many Fortune 500 companies are currently headquartered in LA. You can count them, unfortunately, on two hands. That wasn't the case 20 years ago. Those are also the major contributors to the philanthropies here that benefit all of our citizens. Page 23, this is not a leap of faith. This is, there was reference to the history of business tax reform in the city, and there was the Garcetti-Gruhl initiative back at the beginning of last decade that resulted in a 15% reduction, 3% a year over 5 years in the business tax. What happened during that period of time? Did the general receipts, gross receipts go down? Did the general fund revenues go down, or they go up? They went up. Business tax receipts at that time grew by 21%, and general fund receipts grew also by 23%. The number of taxpayers on the top of page 24 grew by 40%. So we think there's a clear correlation between lowering business taxes and improving the economic health of the city.
Mr. Englander.
On the numbers that you just gave, and I'm referring to the original report, that was the final August 3rd, 2011 report?
August 2nd. August 3rd. Are you talking about Dr. Swenson?
Yeah.
This statistic doesn't come from that. This is looking at, this statistic comes from actually what occurred. We got this statistic through the Department of Finance.
Okay.
This is based on general fund revenues,
right,
and business tax revenues during that period of time, during that 5-year period of time and in fact, two of the members here today, Michael Banner and Mel Cohn, were on BTAC 1 when this was in fact enacted.
Yeah, I recall on that. And I'm just referring on this report on page 9. I don't know if you have a copy of the report in front of you, but
Dr. Swenson's report, I may have it.
I was just doing some analysis, sort of back of the napkin, if you will, but in 2000, 2001, sales tax revenue was at $357,000, where business tax was at $344, was lower then. And then in 2003-4, when the 15% reduction initiative hit, as well as, I believe that was soon followed by the lift from the 50,000 to the 100,000 cap on small business elimination for gross receipts tax as well. We did see a growth in business tax. If you look at the final numbers on up to 2010-11 at 424,000 on the business tax, but yet the sales tax dropped from in the 2003 377,000 to end up in 2010-11 at 296,000. So it shows. I'm
looking at it. I'm on the same page you're on.
Just based on business tax via sales tax comparison, that sales tax and good movement will grow with those reductions. It did the opposite.
Okay, but you have to bear in mind, you're talking about 2010, 2011, and 2009, 2010. What occurred during that period of time? You had a Great Recession, which is the worst recession that hit the United States of America since 1929.
Yeah, but it shows that those changes reflect over time, though, if you go year by year. I just didn't know if you had any analysis on.
Again, in that case, you had receding tide lowering all boats. I mean, is whatever you want to do on a local city basis, if that's going to somehow make a difference on when the U.S. is steeped in a recession as it was, as deep and as dramatic a recession as that was, the answer is no. That would be doing something in the wind, I think, is a common phrase for that. Pardon my French. Spitting in the wind, thank you. Yes, that's better, yeah. Okay, page 23, I'm showing my background, right, which is tin spoon background. Sorry, guys. Page 24. So we did retain Dr. Charles, I say we, the city retained Dr. Charles Swenson at the University of Southern California. He may in fact be present today.
I do see him back there.
Dr. Swenson is present, thank you. So Dr. Swenson performed a report that you just excerpted from. If you want him to address the question when he comes up for public comment, obviously you're welcome to pose it to him at that time.
And it's my intention, by the way, to have a more complete presentation by Dr. Swenson and by the other economists on this, probably at our next meeting, if we can schedule that, so we can have a more thorough discussion. But he's here to respond to specific questions as well, if you'd like. But go ahead, Mr. Gray.
Okay, so and Blue Sky Consulting Group, both were commissioned to do work. They did disagree on the exact magnitude of the impact. Dr. Swenson, in fact, did his own empirical research. I believe Blue Sky relied predominantly on I guess you call it third-party research. That third-party research, we in fact double-checked ourselves, which is who benefit from some state and local economic development policies by Bartik, one of the leading authorities on the field. I'm sorry?
That was a bestseller.
Yes, Craig Morris managed to stay awake during when he perused it on our behalf, so we give him the above and beyond a Call of Duty award for that one. Regardless of their disagreement on the exact magnitude, they both agreed that reducing business taxes will increase economic activity, jobs, and other indirect revenues. Bartik himself says that if a given small suburban jurisdiction with a metropolitan area, for example, Los Angeles City within Los Angeles County, raises its business taxes by 10%, it can expect in the long run a reduction in its business activity from anywhere from 10 to 30%. That's quoted on the bottom of page 24. He also observed that tax effects on business location decisions are generally much larger for metropolitan business location decisions than for intermetropolitan or interstate business location decisions. We'd expect this pattern because a potential business site is likely to have closer substitutes. And we're talking again about LA City versus LA County, offering very similar profits within that same metropolitan area than in other state or metropolitan areas. So the bottom line is, to infer from their document, it basically says, look, if you change something, if you have LA City being uncompetitive in comparison to neighboring jurisdictions, that's going to be more of a problem in terms of losing businesses and having job flight than if you're talking about a comparison of LA to New York, for example, where other considerations come into play. What was interesting about his statistics is these understate the situation. Why do they understate the situation? Because this thing was published in 1991, and it was based on research that occurred for the period 1950s to 1980s. What was missing back then was what? The internet. And the internet means we have a much more mobile economy today which means it's easier for businesses to pick up and move than at any time in the past. And because it's easier for them to do that and to relocate, you can assume correctly that the magnitude of the impact from having higher business taxes would be actually greater in terms of either hurting the economy or helping the economy, depending on whether the tax is higher or lower, comparatively speaking, than what he in fact concludes here.
On that point,
That's discussed on page 25.
on the other hand, I think those changes in communication and reduced cost of transportation and so on also magnify the leakage concern on the multiplier analysis, wouldn't they? I mean, if you have more businesses here, the benefits that you're getting from having those businesses here are probably less now than they would have been in the 50s when those businesses would be buying locally. Now they don't necessarily have to and pay their sales tax locally and so on. So I get your point, but I think it also, there's a countervailing point that the leakage problem is probably more significant now than it was in those days as well. Just observation.
I would leave that one to
Yeah,
Dr.
we'll
Swenson
save
to
that.
address. Why don't you put that one aside for him, if you might. Page 26. So Dr. Swenson concluded that elimination of gross receipts tax would incentivize more businesses to come to expand in and remain in LA. He anticipated that would result in about 120,000 new jobs, and that the loss in business tax revenue would be more than made up for by gains in such other indirect revenues from increased economic activity and employment, such as property taxes, sales taxes, utility taxes, permits, licenses, and fees, and power revenue transfers. The Milken Institute, page 27, we asked them to take a look at the work done by Dr. Swenson and the work done by Blue Sky Consulting Group. I think you're all familiar with the bona fides of the Milken Institute. They took a critical look at both, and they stressed that examining means to improve the business and employment climate in the city of LA is, quote, essential not only for the continued economic health of the city itself, but also for the surrounding region. They were critical of the work done by Blue Sky and cited its considerable lack of transparency. They applauded the work done by Dr. Swenson as being solid and effective in its intended goals and results. And they went on to state that Professor Swenson employed proper methodologies in engaging the LA City business tax study as application of regional economic modeling, background research, and academic reference on effects of changing tax codes on Los Angeles is appropriate. They further found that his statistical approach and methodology was conventional and sound, and they deemed his background research suitable and the various benchmarking used with regards to tax code change stimulus on a typical regional economic system to be appropriate. They concluded that the positives and the methodological approach employed in Dr. Swenson's study, given the data constraints, far outweigh any shortcomings, and although it is likely the net positive impact of changes to the tax code are slightly overstated, most of this effect would be in the very near term. The overall information provided by Dr. Swenson gives a largely accurate portrayal of the economic impacts of the elimination of the city of Los Angeles' gross receipts business tax. So again, that's the Milken Institute. And at the conclusion of my remarks today, I will be handing out their letter that I just directly quoted from, along with a number of other letters that we've received in support of our recommendation. So, where does this lead us? We're talking about the .507 rate, the highest classification, Class 9 being a job killer rate. If you look on page 28, that rate and the miscellaneous services, which is .356, are the two highest rate classes. Those are where all of the high-paying service jobs emanate. Because they're catch-all categories, most innovative new businesses, which are the entrepreneurial engines that fuel this economic growth in the city, and the preponderance of new jobs end up being classified there. That includes clean tech, emerging technologies, engineering, research, and development. And we think that LA risks stunting the growth of its nascent Silicon Beach unless it takes dramatic action to reduce and ultimately eliminate the business tax. If you go to, so here's our recommendation, page 29. So I want to set forth our recommendation on page 29, unless there's any other questions going into that. Our recommendation is a three-stage recommendation. Stage 1, which covers years 1 through 5, is to consolidate the 9 tax classes into 3. So this is tax simplification. We think if you have tax simplification, it avoids any game playing in terms of trying to put somebody into a rate that they don't belong into, and it lends more transparency, more equity, and greater clarity in terms of a business knowing that when they move into the city, this is how they're going to be taxed, as opposed to them taking a risk and not knowing how they're going to be taxed and then finding out that they, uncertainty creates lack of decision or causes people to go elsewhere if they don't know exactly how they're going to be taxed. So we think simplification is an important aspect of our first stage recommendation. So again, 9 classes down to 3. It reduces the top rates. It basically addresses relief to the most onerous and most egregiously high rates. So it takes the top classifications and drops them down to effectively the mid-range. So everything gets reduced to 0.255 in 5 equal installments over those 5 years, and we benchmark it in the end of year 3 and the end of year 5. Our second stage consolidates the 3 tax classes into 2. This is years 6 through 10. Again, cuts the top rate in half. This time, instead of going from 0.507 to 0.255, you're going from 0.255 to 0.127. And again, the offsetting direct and indirect revenue gains must be achieved in the 8th and 10th years to trigger, continued rate reduction. So there are, stopgap measures. There are safety nets built into our proposal in 2-year increments in each of the 5 phases. And then the final phase, and I see your questions, let me just wrap this up on stage 3. That covers years 11 to 15, and during that period of time, the final rates, which are 0.101 and 0.127, are reduced to 0. And of course, at that point, then there's again benchmarking that occurs at the end of years 12 and 14, and I'll explain what that benchmarking means in a moment.
Very good. Thank you. Because I know Mr. Garcetti has to be leaving shortly. If you wanted to squeeze.
No, I'll just say I've probably asked every question I've ever wanted to ask on this stuff. I'm also available as a resource. I can sit on either side of this table if you want. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Englander, sorry.
Can you sit on the right?
Yes, sure.
Just a quick question on the triggers. Is this proposed to be an automatic stage, or is it a legislative action? How are you?
Automatic stage. So that what you do. Why don't we go right to that? So if you look at page 30, this shows what happens in the first 5 years. You can see the classifications today on the left. Again, they're kind of Byzantine classifications, but you'll see that there's 9 classes plus some other categories. You can see the rates before and the rates after reflecting that reduction. And then you can see what you end up with is 3 rates, which is on the bottom: wholesale, retail and media, and services and professions. And you can see they're taxed at 0.101, 0.127, 0.255. No longer do you have a 0.315, no longer do you have a 0.356, no longer do you have a 0.507 rate.
I think Mr. Sealy could correct us, but we differed a little bit from the BTAC in committee, right? Didn't we do a yearly check-in? Instead of every 3-year automatic? It was a yearly check-in. It wasn't anything automatic, but it gave a mandatory every year assessment so that those of us doing budgets in these tough years would have a yearly check-in.
Was it part of the budget process, or was it
No, it didn't specify. There's no automatic trigger, but it's
no
yearly.
legislative direct action. It was just a yearly review.
Exactly. A yearly review that would also go to the Budget and Finance Committee, though.
Well, okay, let me address that, because it has to be automatic, frankly, in our view. Because if it's not automatic, then what city is going to, if you're saying that the business knows that at the end of the first year or second year or third year, it's going to require legislative action.
No, it was nothing proactive. It was automatically happening, and it was a yearly check-in. So just to be clear, it wasn't that you needed permission each year.
Okay, we disagree in terms of a yearly check-in. We think that you need to send a clear signal to businesses that you're serious about reducing, and to give time to be able to see those effects, hence the first check-in being in year 3 and the second check-in being in year 5.
It just sounds to me like this is a technical difference of what is a yearly check-in and then defining what that meant.
Exactly.
So I think you're on the same page.
I think we're very open to how we do it.
Well, but if I could just, make it, maybe get to the more fundamental point on the triggers.
Sure.
Because the original BTAC proposal obviously didn't involve that, and I know that this was a, work in progress that was based on a lot of input by a lot of people, and there's, some compromising involved and so on.
Exactly.
But at that first report, BTAC opined that triggers or milestones would doom the business tax reform effort to failure. And I assume that the reason is because of the predictability issue. A business that's making a siting decision has to know, am I going to get this beneficial tax treatment for a number of years, or are they going to pull the rug out from me?
The concern is trusting the city council in this case to not change its mind arbitrarily.
Exactly.
Okay, so if a city is going to make a decision, if a business is going to make a decision that involves a lot of things, including capital expenditures and an investment in moving their business into the city of LA or deciding to grow their business in the city of LA, which usually involves facilities and equipment and employees and what have you. And if it then turns out that they're in a catch-22, and guess what, the rates there was a temporary reduction in rates, and now they're back up because you have some sunset provision, or you have the ability to reverse what you did, and then that business is going to say, why should I take that risk in the city of LA when I can go across the street where there is no such risk?
Right.
And so what we're trying to do is reverse 77 years of negative image with respect to being job and business friendly in the city of LA. And that requires bold action in order to do that. Now, we did modify, to put in benchmarks. We did that based on, frankly, the information coming out of Blue Sky, which was challenging the information from, in terms of the magnitude of the economic benefits from Dr. Swenson's. We said, fine. We believe the work done by Dr. Swenson, and that work has subsequently been validated by the Milken Institute, so we were agreeable to putting in a form of benchmarking. And we'll talk about what that benchmark. I'll still get to your question, Mr. Englander. We'll get to that form of benchmarking here momentarily, or right now, if you'd like.
Take you off track. Go ahead.
Okay. So page 31 talks about why we feel that the first level of relief should go to these higher brackets. So this is all about why are we changing classes 7 through 9, but not changing classes 1 through 6. And we'll take them class by class, but classes 1 and 2 already we feel are at a low rate at 0.101, that we don't think that's going to be a tipping point that causes a business not to locate in the city of LA. Classes 3 through 5 are higher rates, are at 0.127, but they're land-focused businesses. It's tougher for companies to move if it's a theater or if it's a restaurant or if it's a retail store trying to serve that local community. You can't really serve that local community unless you're physically sited in that local community. And they also, by the way, get greater services that they consume. And that includes, and in classes 6 through 9 now, the ones we are addressing, those are the ones that are most mobile. Those are the service firms that we think are the greatest risk of leaving the city, and those are the ones that, by the way, are taxed at such precipitously high rates, ranging from 0.315 to 0.507. So, Mr. Englander, your question is addressed on page 32. And our plan does have safety belts in there that says what you do is, let's say this committee decided to go forward with BTAC's recommendation, which we hope you will do, and that the City Council approves that recommendation coming out of this committee. Then presumably the first year that you would implement this would be 2014, or 2000. It would either apply to this year, which gets taxed in February of next year. The benchmark would be, in that case, 2012. You look at the receipts that were received, the general fund receipts for each of these categories that are tagged to economic activity on the bottom of page 32. Business taxes, sales taxes, property taxes, utility taxes, license permits and fees, transit occupancy taxes, documentary parking, etc., power revenue, all of these things. And you say, okay, they equaled whatever dollar amount they equaled in 2012. Now, 3 years from now, after you've had these phased reductions in the business tax, you would look at them again and say, okay, are the general fund receipts from in these areas lower or higher or the same? If they're lower, you stop. You put a stop sign on the business tax rollback, and you just stop it right there in its tracks. If they're equal to or higher, then you're saying, you know what, no harm, no foul. We're no worse off. We're, in fact, equal to or better off. Let's continue to roll back the business tax.
So if that baseline is the index, is there a margin that is above that index? In other words, we expect a certain growth rate, particularly now given the state of the economy of X, say 3 to 5%, and we know our expenditures are going to go up as well with pension and healthcare costs and all the unfunded liabilities, et cetera. That we're counting on with a growth. So if this is a new index that's established for a baseline, is there then a margin above that baseline to cover what we expect in additional out-of-pocket costs as those costs go up as well, or is that?
The answer is no, and the problem with that is what you get into, Mr. Englander, is then the question of, okay, well, whose projection are we going to assume? You know, what rate of growth should we assume, and what's the defense for that? Now you get into the uncertainty and the lack of predictability that causes the businesses. You end up having a fait accompli, a self-fulfilling prophecy, which is the business says, okay, so what they've done is they put in something here that's an assumption that we either agree with or disagree with, and it's easy for them to disagree with and say, okay, this is just another way of gaming us. Why should we? Why should we make a decision to site in LA?
I'm not, assuming you did all this, and you still had the automatic, and I'm just playing devil's advocate, asking the questions and trying to figure out, how this would be.
I don't see any horns, so I'm not sure. Go ahead.
I'm sorry?
Nothing. That was a joke about the devil. It's all right.
All right. So, yeah, and the devil's of the details. So on the details on this is, as we've looked at and know that we've got expenses increasing over time, and we have to anticipate and hope the economy grows, and that will grow as well. If that baseline, in other words, if we're there 2 years from now, and we didn't see any growth in all the other fields because of the economy and other things, but we know we still have expenditures going up, how do we attribute, if there's no index? I mean, I hear what you're saying, but so was that ever contemplated?
We did discuss it at BTAC.
Have a margin.
We did discuss it at BTAC, and the issue is, and I'm an investment banker of 32 years experience. I've seen a lot of projections done by businesses, and if the city's projection is comparably accurate to the projections I've seen out of businesses over that period of time, then I'd say that you can take that projection and throw it out the window. Seriously. So if you're trying to make a projection and say, okay, here it's about certainty versus lack thereof. You can point to what it was in 2012 or 2013, whatever your base year, and you can make a comparison to that. And if you say, okay, but we're really not going to tie it to that, we're going to tie it to what our projection is for the next 2 or 3 years, and then from a standpoint of business, it says, okay, so what if their projection is wrong? You've just put me into a catch-22. It's not worth the risk for me. Why structure it in such a way that it makes it, you want to make it so it's simple. Keep it simple from a standpoint of the business, because otherwise, who are we kidding here?
I'm not suggesting it tied, and I'm not suggesting anything. I'm simply asking the question if it was taken into consideration, quite frankly.
It was discussed, and
if it was assumed like it was a 2% annual growth of all these other factors, would it be above that as a margin? But you're saying no, this would just be the baseline, assuming no growth. That's just what I wanted to know.
It's a baseline, assuming, okay, it's at a point in time, you compare against it at that point. You're comparing against that point in time to see, are you below, equal to, or better than?
Thanks.
You're welcome.
If I guess a related point to that would be kind of looking at the obverse of what you've just said, is that I'm hopeful that as we move forward with business tax reform, we're also going to continue to take a broader range of steps to improve the business environment, as I mentioned at the outset. Regulatory reform, consolidation of review processes, reduced permitting requirements, all the other things that frustrate businesses so much here compared to some of our
and all of which would be welcome.
And all of which would hopefully be productive in increasing the amount of revenues that we receive as we create more economic activity. So the challenge is figuring out if we're going to be doing that and increasing revenues because we're stimulating economic activity for non-tax reform reasons, that increased economic activity is going to justify the continuation of the reduced business tax, whether or not the reduced business tax has anything to do with it or not.
Mr. Krikorian, I think you should look at it from the perspective of the city making a very profound statement that it is welcoming to business, and it is open for business, and it is job and business friendly, and that includes a integrated plan to affect that, one highly visible component of which is business tax reduction and ultimate elimination, than trying to just declare victory and move on. If your economic activity goes up, trying to figure out what came from the business tax reduction versus what came from expediting permits and consolidating licensing decisions, et cetera, it worked. What does it matter which one? You're never going to be able to figure out which one did what. That's a great theoretical problem. But I don't see it as a problem. I see it as, that's a huge win. Just declare victory and move.
No, but I'm sorry if I could add, but then that just throws away your whole premise that this will effectuate.
I beg your pardon?
It throws away your whole premise then, because if we just take this in isolation, you start off by saying that all the economic activity will increase revenues through other sources and taxes, like real estate, property taxes, whatever.
Correct.
But now you're saying, well, if we do this plus other things, and we don't know if this really contributed to the additional.
That's not what I said, sir.
Okay.
What I said is, I was following his assumption that you did all these other things. We weren't here to study any of those other things. We were tasked to do one thing, look at the business tax. And we came up, and I skipped that part, but we came up with a bunch of other recommendations too, but this clearly is the guts of our recommendation. If you do this, and the city properly publicizes it, I mean, I would do this, and I'd beat your drum as loudly as possible.
We'll do some
People, businesses are going to notice.
Okay.
Businesses are going to notice. The realtors are going to notice. The tax advisors are going to notice. All the people that right now are steering companies away from the city's jurisdictions will change that course of conduct.
Let's assume we don't do all those other things. Let's just assume we just do this. How will we know with the safety belt that in fact we are revenue neutral through this tax reform?
Because you'll check against it. You're going to look at what those revenues are, and you're going to benchmark against that. And if it turns out this is all you do, and for whatever reason it doesn't work, then you'll stop the rollbacks at that time. And there won't be a 10 or a 15-year plan here. It won't even be a 5-year plan. It'll be having been a 3-year plan. So that safety belt is a safety belt. If, in fact, we're wrong, which we don't think we are, and the economic research says we're not wrong, you do have a way of, this is what was different from our original recommendation, as Mr. Krikorian correctly observed. We have now put in a benchmark system for doing that. So you will have a way of judging whether in fact it's been effective or not. This is designed so that we're not here to hurt the city. I'm a native of Los Angeles and have been, other than having grown up for a brief period of time in Santa Monica for I've been virtually my entire life. I was born in LA. So the last thing, I'm former chairman of LADC, I'm chairman of the Los Angeles Police Foundation. The last thing I want to do is do anything that would hurt this city. This, I think, the city is hurting right now. And this is something that I think we need to do to make it healthier. And if you make it healthier, then that's going to benefit all employees, both public and private sector, and everybody that lives and does business and plays in the city of LA.
If I could pull back just one more layer of the onion on this. Well, first of all, the statements that you're making, I don't think we'd all be sitting here if the political will wasn't to try to get to a place where we can reduce and finally eliminate business tax. There's no question. So a lot of the statements that you're making, I think we're all on the same page. It's getting there, and it's something that certainly I've heard all of us individually and collectively talk about as well, and actions we've taken as well. But without getting into that, and so going into the actual details. Those are some of the questions I have, is how do we get to A to B? So in looking at some of the benchmarks, for example, where...
You're on page 32?
32, in the categories of sales tax, for example, utility tax, license permits and fees, which now are, by the way, are cost-neutral, cost recovery. Those are paying. Many of those have to be broken out. We have to get into that level of detail to incorporate this, to create that baseline. And the reason why a lot of the programs that we have that collect license permits and fees don't necessarily go into the general fund, if you will, because they go into cost recovery, fee collected, fee for service programs. So they're tied to that. But over the course of the last year and the last 24 months, a lot of these categories have been changed. Sales tax, for example, it was brought up earlier. There's a half-cent sales tax ballot measure on the ballot. But a lot of these things have been changed. And when creating the baseline, is there sort of an asterisk, if you will, or is there documents that supporting documents that show there's going to be growth in these categories because those fees and taxes were increased? Does that take into account, or is just a simple across the board, here's where you were last year, here's where you are this year, therefore the reduction in business tax shows you're doing better, when in fact it could be actually a reduction in categorically, but financially we're receiving more revenue because those revenue streams have been increased. Is that equation factored in at all?
No, it is not. When we conceived this, there was no sales tax sales tax hike on the horizon, for example. And I can see that you could have, there's going to be noise throughout. There's going to be noise throughout this, just like you talked about the expectation that the economy was going to continue to improve. Well, it could continue to improve, and it might not continue to improve. It could actually slip back into recession. We know there's plenty of risks out there associated with. So this is designed to be effectively saying, you know what, there's upside and there's downside. to anything. And all this is what we wanted was certainty. And the way you have certainty, as opposed to projecting what the sales tax hike will do and what people's buying decisions will do in terms of whether they all of a sudden start buying their cars outside the city limits or not, we didn't factor any of that because that's all speculative. So we're saying, okay, if your first year if your year one rollback is 2014, then your benchmark is the prior year. And if it's 2015, then your benchmark is 2014. And period, end of story. Just saying, what's the year prior to the first year of rollback? And that's your benchmark. And those numbers have the benefit of being black and white.
Right. And then the last question on that is, on these categories, are they considered what is actually collected versus what's billed out? Because we can go through here and look at parking fines, for example, which Mr. Zine likes to talk about a lot. We've got a lot of money out there in parking fines that aren't actually paid, but they show as a revenue stream.
Okay, so it looks at what's reported in the general fund. I don't know I don't know what the general fund shows gross versus net.
Well, it depends on
for example.
If you look in the budget books, those are produced by the mayor before the final budget's approved, but then it doesn't go back and figure out what was actually collected versus what's being budgeted. So I just didn't know which numbers you use.
We use the numbers provided by the Department of Finance representing the general fund receipts. And I can't tell you whether that's gross or net, whether that reflects write-offs or anything else.
And I'm assuming it's cash basis, but...
We're going to have the COA come up in a moment, so maybe they...
Yeah.
And I know I'm getting in a little more detail.
It's a good question. I haven't heard that one before. That's a good question. And my presumption is, by the way, coming back to parking, I assume you guys are going to fix that problem. But anyway, you should certainly. So page 33, we're talking about prudent responsible tax reform. We talk about checking the benchmarks, and I think I explained how that works. The objective and expectations that simplification from 9 classes to 3, and then to 2, and then to none will be at worst revenue neutral and at best significantly revenue positive. Page 34 just gives you a graphical representation of how this works. Page 35, if you look at the green light, red light in the tabs, you can see what the annual reduction is in phase 1. This is stage 1. It shows you what the status quo was. And again, we'll update this. This shows 10-11. We can make that, 11-12. I think we have that statistic, so I can get that from the Department of Finance between now and your next meeting. Then you have year 1, year 2, year 3, year 4, year 5. You can see roughly it's a $25 million reduction each year, rolling the rates from 0.507, 356, and 315 down to 0.255. Those are the only classifications impacted initially. And again, the green light, red light shows you the years where you do benchmarking before you proceed to the next year. What does that mean? Page 36. So at the end of the first 5 years, guess what? We're a little more competitive. We're not a lot more competitive. That's why we have 3 stages. And this is what was surprising. So even with that significant a move, instead of being the highest tax jurisdiction, we've become the 3rd highest tax jurisdiction in LA County. So is that better? Absolutely. Is that good? No, it's still not good because we're still almost twice as high as the next jurisdiction, which is Inglewood. On down the line, you can see the 15th highest jurisdiction, again, out of 88 cities, is 0.04%. So that's why we're saying let's keep moving. And you go to page 37, you can see how this looks. Instead of just comparing it to the 15 highest tax jurisdictions, we compared it to some of the significant jurisdictions like Pasadena, Long Beach, Culver City, et cetera. And you can see how we compare there. The current rate versus the proposed rate. Page 38 lays out stage 2, which is reductions from 3 rates down to 2 rates, covering years 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10, with benchmarks again at the end of year 8 and at the end of year 10. That reduction is roughly $15 million a year. And what that does is it effectively takes you down at this point to 2 classifications. And those 2 rates are 0.127 and 0.101. What does that mean in terms of how the city stacks up versus competing jurisdictions? You see on page 39. Now, guess what? We're not in the top 5 anymore, but we're still in the top 10. But we're certainly much more reasonable. We're at the highest bracket is 1.127 versus you now have Santa Monica, Culver City, Inglewood, et cetera, above us. So much better positioning. Again, page 40 compares to some of the other jurisdictions, not necessarily the top 15 highest taxed. And page 41 lays out the final 5 years. which is years 11 through 15, and this now reflects the reduction and ultimate elimination of the last two categories, last two rate classifications of .127 and .101. Again, testing at the end of year 12 and at the end of year 14. And again, if none of this works and we're wrong, then you never get past year 3. And finally, on page 42, just to sum up, it says, business tax elimination broad-based and all-encompassing. We think our recommendation is that you reduce the business taxes across the board for all industries and all size companies. We think it's an opportunity for LA once and for all to shatter its business and job unfriendly reputation, and frankly the 30-year plus history of job declines, and that is job declines we're talking about, roughly 10% almost. And you'll note that the vast preponderance, 88% of net new job creation is driven by small business, and because we don't have Fortune 500 to speak of anymore, we're very much a small business town. I know because my business serves middle market and small businesses here in LA City, LA County, and Southern California. That's our presentation. I know you've asked questions along the way. I'm going to pause for a moment to see any of my colleagues have anything they'd like to add that perhaps I missed.
That was...
I would just, kind of anecdotally, we talked earlier about Silicon Beach, and that's an area for growth. And I just happened to have my daughter text me, who just went to work for Maker Studios. Maker Studios just received about $50 million worth of private equity investment from Time Warner. They were located in LA. They moved 80% of their workforce to Culver City. So this is an example, real time, of what's going on, the kinds of companies we'd like to keep. And I'm not going to say that they move because of the business tax, but this is a reality that companies don't stay in Los Angeles, and we have to figure out a solution for that. But this is the kind of industry we want. It was in LA, left.
Well, and I think there's universal agreement about the need to address that very problem. And I don't think there's a person that in our council or in government or in the business community or any other stakeholder that would disagree with the importance of doing that. The trickier issue for us is figuring out the most cost-effective vehicles to do that make the most sense given the budgetary situation that we're in. And this has been a very thorough and detailed presentation. Thank you, Mr. Greif, for getting through as much as you did in such a short amount of time. I appreciate
You're welcome.
it. Members, do you have other questions at this point for the BTEC? Or Mr. Cohn, you were starting to lean towards the microphone. Did you want to add something else?
Fellow committee members have covered all the bases.
I would add one thing that I just handed out to take you through the package. This is the letter from Milken Institute that I quoted from. It's the first document. The second document is a statement from LADC. The third document is a statement from VICA in support of our recommendation. The fourth document is from the Black Business Association in support of our recommendation. The fifth document is from the largest, speaking of venture capital, since Mr. Banner just made reference to a venture capital investment, the largest venture capital fund in Southern California is based here in Los Angeles in Century City. But what's interesting about this letter from GRP Partners and Stephen Dietz, who's the president of GRP Partners, it talks about that they have made effectively that a lot of their businesses are exiting the city of LA because of the tax situation. And this is a letter in recommendation of reducing and ultimately eliminating the business tax. They talk about employing about, he says, our companies do not generally become profitable until they're generating 10 million to 50 million in revenue, by which time they employ 70 to 200 people. So in this case, context is 0.5% business tax is onerous, and it is one consideration in our decision to locate new companies in Santa Monica or Culver City, where the gross receipts tax for corporate headquarters is 1/4 the amount that would be paid in Los Angeles. It says, in fact, GRP currently has 18 portfolio companies located in LA County, and only 2 are located in the city of Los Angeles. And so that's and I'm quoting from his third paragraph, but I would invite you to read that because, again, this is not just any company. This is the largest VC fund in Southern California.
So one thing about
and then there's some other letters here as well. I'm sorry.
I'm sorry, but since they are the largest VC company around, I'm wondering why they're locating new companies in Santa Monica when we've pointed out that Santa Monica has the same.
With Santa Monica, that only applies to services, that only provides to doctors, accountants, and lawyers. Doctors, accountants, and lawyers, and guess what? That's not the guys they're funding.
Venture capitalists don't fund.
No, they're funding technology. Technology is what drives. Technology is what drives the economy. Service business and technology companies are what drives the economy, and we need to be focused on that. I know that because of the companies I see. And when I started as an investment banker, I had a lot of manufacturing clients. That's not the case anymore.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Zine.
Just a few. The CRA is gone. That helped businesses establish. Enterprise zones came around. That helped businesses establish. Short-term solution. The council turnover, a new mayor is going to be coming in July 1st. How do we assure businesses that want to invest with these changes that are by ordinance, not by charter, that they will sustain and not change as the reflection of the leadership in Los Angeles changes? How do we assure businesses of that? They come in and buy into this. You're going to say?
I was going to ask the same question. You can't legally tie a future council's hands.
Well, see, what happens is, the question is, how do we assure them, because you're going to invest a business in Los Angeles, wherever, and you're going to put the investment, and you're going to move in here, you like all the plans that are being made, and then you get a new administration that comes in, and since it's an ordinance, it can always be changed. How do we give them that assurance? How do we safeguard them so they won't figure, you know what, this is just a carrot and it's going to take it away?
Both of, I can't speak for all of the mayoral candidates. I guess I can speak for three of them. I know that Councilmember Garcetti, City Controller Gruhl, and Kevin James have all come out in favor of our recommendation. So, yes, there's a possibility there's other mayors and through other mayoral candidates. Jan Perry, I know, is not in favor. I don't know about the fifth individual who I don't really know. Expectation, so the expectation is the next mayor will be in support of this. I know the current mayor is in support of this. Antonio is in support of this.
What do you do with the council?
With the council.
What do I do with the council? Well, if your answer is because there's a new council coming, let's kick the can down the road to the new council.
No, I'm not saying that. I'm saying, how do we assure businesses that we want to attract? I support what you're doing, but I want to say to a business that's going to come in, how do we assure them that this will continue in spite of the political change that's going to take place due to term limits?
In other words, we've pretty much established that businesses need reliability. Businesses need predictability. And Mr. Zine's point is, if the political process is not predictable, and I suppose Prop 218 may figure into this as well, because once we enact business tax reform, changing it back might very well be forever barred to us.
Well, in which case, I guess that solves the problem, doesn't it?
Well, that's only under the elimination part.
That's
That's only under, once on Prop 218, that's only once it's gone completely, and then bringing it back. Adjusting it
I'm just trying to
is not.
Okay.
I don't think you,
You can't, do you have
I believe once the rates are reduced, even in phases, I don't think they can ever be raised. I think
I think you might very well be right about that. We're going to ask the CLA when they come up.
The city attorneys opined on that already.
Okay.
What did they say?
You cannot raise the rates.
Okay, so once it's done, there's assurance for a period of time, at least 3 to 5 years. We don't know after that.
If we could, real quick, I guess the CLA will come up next on that.
Okay, the other question is bonds. We've got a lot of bonds, and we need to have a hefty reserve fund to make sure those bonds, because of the rate, how do we assure that with this reduction? How do we assure the stability of the bond market and our rating that we get when we buy bonds?
Okay, so we're talking about in our presentation, you saw it was a $25 million reduction in each of those first 3 years. Actually, each of those first 5 years, and then 15 million the succeeding 5 years. Again, if you don't think that this will result in increased levels of economic activity, I presume you won't vote for this. We are confident it will result in, we're not inventing something here. We're not inventing the wheel. This has been done before and proven effective. And what we're talking about is attracting business. At some point, the city has to say, we need to get into business attraction, not business repulsion or deterrence. And that's what we're talking about here. And if you attract businesses, you attract employment. And if you attract employment, you have a healthy city.
I totally agree with what you're saying. I just want to...
So those other revenues are all sources of receipts for the general fund. And to assume that economic activity is going to go up, but those revenues aren't going to be there, I don't think there's such a linkage.
Okay.
All right, colleagues, anything for the BTAC panel.
Anybody else have anything they want to add?
You've all been very generous with your time, both today and over the long course of this path. So thank you very much for the countless hours that you've put in to bringing us to this point. Thank you very much. Appreciate all your good work on this.
I wanted to say thank you as well. And if you have, when you have those updates available, if we get the opportunity to be prior to the next meeting.
I will email it to each of the
That'd be great.
6 of you.
Have time to review them.
Absolutely. Do we want to leave a package like this for...
If you don't mind, I'll make sure you get it. Sure. Yeah.
Mr. Garcetti and Mr. Buscaino. So Garcetti got the presentation, but he didn't get this.
All right.
And do we need a set for whoever keeps the records here? Okay. We do that as well. Thank you.
All right.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all very much. Appreciate your work on this very much. I'd like to ask the CLA to come forward now because we've already pondered a few questions here that seem appropriate for response. Mr. Miller, you've been engaged in this long road that we've taken as well, so I'm going to invite you to make any general comments that you'd like to make at this point about the BTAC proposal, about concerns that we should be considering as we're analyzing this, and then I think members have a number of questions still remaining that would be appropriately directed toward you as well, so welcome.
Certainly. For the record, Jerry Miller, Chief Legislative Analyst. We certainly recognize the desire of the council to reform the tax code, and particularly the gross receipts tax, and realize the importance of being business friendly. I think as my staff has commented throughout the process, and part of it is 218, which you've discussed, is that it's important to do so in a manner that does, in fact, protect our solvency, protect our ability to provide the services to the public. The proposal with the triggers as being discussed, is something that we feel very strongly that we need to look at, a responsible way to proceed. Going forward, obviously, it was important to hear this presentation and get some of the information, and moving forward, we'll be working with you to try to develop an approach that, again, it does accomplish your policy goals, as well as ensure that we do protect our general fund and have some certainty on revenue flows, because certainty on the business side is vital, and certainty on our side in terms of revenue flows is equally as vital in terms of our credit rating and our ability to borrow, and the necessity to provide capital projects and funding for our constituents.
Well, on that subject of Prop 218, just to start it off, I think the city attorney, as was indicated, has opined that reductions in the rates themselves, if they were to be restored, that could constitute an increase in taxation that would be subject to Prop 218. Is that your understanding of it?
If it were a straight, flat-out reduction in the rate, that is probably correct. It would depend on the wording of the ordinance. There could be a temporary sunset. It could be a rate that is tied to certain triggers. So there would be ways of drafting an ordinance that would not set in stone a future rate. I do understand the concern from a business standpoint. So there are ways of doing that. So at the end of the day, it's going to come down to, if there is a reduction in business tax, how that reduction is worded in the ordinances.
So you think that it would be feasible to construct an ordinance that would contain a trigger provision, as was described by BTAC, that would pass muster with 218 if the triggers were to be pulled, if the revenue increases didn't come about and the triggers took place, that would not constitute a Prop 218 taxable increase?
I believe that is feasible. Again, as has been said, the devil's is in the details. When we actually see a proposal in language, we need to work with city attorney.
Okay.
But I do believe that conceptually that can be achieved, yes.
Okay. Members?
Go ahead.
I don't know if it's too soon to ask you the question, but looking at the phase in 15 years, has the CLA looked at any other alternatives in terms of how many years we should be phasing this out? Or do you approve or support these recommendations as written?
Well, we haven't looked at any phasing alternatives. That's certainly going forward. One of the things we want to do, again, I think I apologize, I was in another meeting, so joined you late, but I know that there's been a series of reports and triggers proposed, so, getting a sense of where this committee wants to go and where the council wants to go and evaluate alternatives. So whether they're alternatives to the 15-year trigger, certainly we recognize and want to help the council reach the goal of reducing the business tax and being more competitive. Very, very clearly. So if that is your goal, we do strongly support doing so in a manner that does include triggers and includes mechanisms to ensure that if things aren't working as projected, that we're not putting the general fund at risk.
Well, certainly the triggers are one concern, but on the other hand, if we're saying this has such huge benefits, why not do it soon and cut down the 15 years, and if that's possible, with keeping in mind the triggers are in place to protect us. If it's possible to reap the benefits in a shorter period of time while keeping in triggers and have enough data on there to figure out if the triggers are working or not, that's possibly something we could look at.
And actually, if you will, I might refer you to the first Swenson report, which included a number of different options. I don't know if the CLA has analyzed each of those individually, but Professor Swenson compared a number of different scenarios, more targeted reductions, for example, industry-specific reductions, reductions for Los Angeles businesses that have stayed for a certain number of years or that have increased the number of employees. There's an almost unlimited number of ways to skin this cat, but BTAC has considered all of those. They're sort of putting all their money on red right now. So this is they're on, maybe on black is a better, on green isn't it?
Well,
so
if they're looking at green, if there's something in terms of what all the proposals have been made, looking at BTEC's recommendation now, thoroughly reviewing that, if you guys have formulated an opinion in terms of the timing of it, or which.
We have not yet, but no, we're looking at the broad spectrum of ideas right now.
As we continue these discussions, if you will, first, I, for one, let me just make it crystal clear, I'm absolutely committed to figuring out a way to eliminate, reduce and then eliminate, and get on that path personally. And so I'm there, and that's why I'm already started looking at more detailed conversation. We've had the conversations since this report came out, had many of you on one-on-one discussions and going through these reports. That's why I look forward to, as well as the updated numbers. But I also want to take a responsible approach, particularly as a member of the Budget and Finance Committee, and dealing with these different scenarios every single day, and seeing these changes, and seeing the fluctuations in different revenue streams, with the idea that if those revenue streams don't provide the automatic triggers, that also is going to tell us we've got some other serious problems. And if that doesn't work, and all of a sudden we don't have the revenue coming in, we're going to be right back at the table again, talking about, what we're really talking about in the scheme of things, and put things in perspective, is the business tax is pretty much equivalent to the entire fire department. And so when you talk about eliminating that kind of number, you do so in a very responsible manner, and you take it very seriously. And it's not rushed. 15 years is certainly not rushed. I, for one, I don't see a way to get there sooner, but I also think you need a guarantee to businesses that it's going to happen. I wanted the legal answer, of course, the same one that Zine asked, which was legislatively, I understand you can't tie the future hands of a council. But no matter who a mayor is, and again, this goes, if it's a 15-year plan, it doesn't matter who the next mayor is, because it's going to be the next mayor after that as well that will inherit this. So there's no crystal ball there. But I don't see the political will of any body, any new council body coming in, or mayor in the future, once this is in place for 10 years, and trying to unwind that. I'm pretty confident that if we get something done, now, then we're on a good ground towards elimination, not just reduction. Having said that, I think we do need to get into at least a conversation with our CAO as well, and looking at if we go down this road in this scenario, getting into some of the details. What I'd like to see, Mr. Chairman, on, for example, when you create those baselines, I think it's critically important to measure, if we can, if we're going to take a snapshot from, a lot of these revenues, when we look at the revenue, by the time we look at it, it's a year old, because it takes a year to come through, or we've done the TRAN, or we've borrowed against it, or we're waiting for the county reimbursement, or we're waiting for the actual collection. I think we need to at some point in the future, get into the discussion on that level of detail to figure out if we're actually creating a baseline, it better be accurate, and it better be based on, was it cash, was it accrual, was it collected, was it not? Nobody's asked those questions. We better get into that level of detail to determine that baseline is in fact absolutely accurate, because we're hinging everything on that. And so that also has to include, for example, if there's been fee increases, an ordinance passed on those increases, but they haven't yet been realized because the ordinances just kicked in, but we created this baseline without consideration of those increases, as an example. Then the following year, we had, one of those categories, a major jump in revenue. And we're saying, oh, look, the economy's getting better, so therefore that's part of the automatic trigger and reductions. But in fact, it wasn't. It was based on an increase that the council voted on for additional revenues from that category. We just got to get into that level to ensure we have to protect. We have to protect as much as we talk about expenditures and waste and efficiencies. We also have to protect, on the flip side of the equation, the revenue portion. Because our hands are tied in creating new revenue, particularly under Prop 218, and not wanting to go back to additional taxes and fees. And so that's the kind of detail, eventually, at some point in this committee, once we've gone through the exercise of all the other reports, I'd like to have that conversation.
I think that was tremendously well stated, Mr. Englander, and let me just tag team on that, because we started today off with Mr. Tobin talking about his members' frustration, and it's a frustration that I totally understand. And I think, there is a sense of urgency, certainly in the business community, to get action done, and I think that we're now at a point where broadly throughout this building, there's a sense of urgency in getting progress made as well. So I hope that, the level of detail that we do our work in this committee will not be an indication to anyone that this is going to be the death of 1,000 cuts, that this is going to be the long parade to nowhere or whatever. That is not the case. This committee and the Budget and Finance Committee are going to take these recommendations not only exceptionally seriously, but we're going to give them the serious analysis that they merit for that very reason, Mr. Englander, because, just as no business would make a decision that reduced its revenues by 10% without thinking a lot about it and figuring it out and considering all the economic analysis and all the implementation analysis of it, we're not going to do that either. We're going to do it in a way that we have the highest level of confidence. And Mr. Greif, I have a lot of confidence in your confidence, and I appreciate that you've expressed it today. But I think we also have a due diligence obligation to make sure that we have looked below the surface on this, down to the nuts and bolts of it, to make sure that we're not taking an action that ends up costing any amount of revenues at a time when we're facing a $500 million deficit, unless we're confident that it, as a matter of cause and effect, it's going to produce benefits more than it costs. So, Mr. Zine.
Just a couple of questions. One is Community Impact Statement, West Hills Neighborhood Council against proposal. Do you know what the story is with that on the agenda.
I'm sorry, I don't. Those come through the city clerk's
Has the
office, so I
item-
don't.
Item 1, and it's got the community impact statement, yes, against proposal, West Hills Neighborhood Council. So it doesn't have anything else. I'm just curious to see what the issue was with West Hills Neighborhood Council, which is.
We'll see if we can get it from the file, Mr.
Part of
Zimmer.
the-
I believe they might have submitted that when West Hills was part of CD3, but now
Oh,
they're
it wasn't
part of
that.
CD12.
They have no concerns about anything.
And then the other question I have is, and I don't want to beat this thing because the election's next month, but if we take the taxes that we're talking about and phasing them out, and then business says this is great, but then we come in with other taxes such as Measure A, how does that affect the business structure where they say you're giving us this, but you're giving us that? You know what I'm talking about?
I know exactly what you're talking about,
So
yeah.
How do we convince the businesses that what we're doing here is good, at the same time, we're coming around on the other side of the corner with something else that is not in the neighboring cities, it's only in Los Angeles? How do we convince them that what we're serious is doing and to reduce that impact on them, at the same time not come in with another tax on the other side, which obviously businesses are going to say, you're giving us this, but you're taking that?
Well, I couldn't agree more, and I mean, what you're talking about really is a truly a multifaceted issue. I mean, for one, 218 largely addresses that. And now, without getting to sales tax specifically, I mean, there are whole quality of life issues, and we've talked about issues of public safety and tree trimming and streets and all the things we can't do that also impact the desire of businesses to locate here, the desire of people to live here, to work in those businesses. There are the processing issues that were discussed here, and even recently, some friends of I have had some horrible experiences in trying to expand businesses or open restaurants.
Going through the process?
Going through the process. So you've got process issues, you've got tax issues, you have quality of life issues. So that is an extraordinarily difficult question to answer. But I think at the end of the day, I think there needs to be, again, as much as possible, consistency and the ability for businesses to project what's going to happen in the future would be essential.
And then to brace for that.
Right.
Yeah, and just to add to that point about how there is an interrelatedness of all of this. If we eliminated business tax entirely right now, I think many businesses would still be concerned in making their siting decisions about the many other problems of doing business in Los Angeles. As I mentioned before, the delay in getting anything done and so on. And by the same token, there will also be a significant delay in any revenue increase that we realize in our budget. Because even if a business decides, by golly, it's great, they reduced the business tax, I'm moving. By the time they set up shop and establish themselves here, I mean, we all know there could be years of delay because of our regulatory constraints and so forth. So we wouldn't realize those revenues. There will be a significant lag time, let's say, in realizing the new revenues that comes from new business generation. So unless we have additional, in my view, unless we have additional revenues to help us bridge this short-term budget deficit challenge that we have, we won't be able to do the other things necessary, the community plan updates, the zoning reform, all of the other things that we know that we need to do to make this a more business-friendly city. So, in my view, they are directly related. If we have those additional revenues, we will be able to do the sorts of things, quality of life issues and the business development issues and the reform things that will help lay the groundwork for the benefit that will be derived from business tax reform or elimination. Anything further for the CLA colleagues, because we're running a little short on time. What I would like to do is, first of all, thank all of you and everyone who's here for this discussion. I'm sorry? No, not yet, because I see Mr. Swenson's here, Dr. Swenson's here, and I want to thank you for coming down, Dr. Swenson, and I know that Blue Sky is here as well. But what I think we'll do is at the next meeting, and I apologize, this has been a long discussion already. At the next meeting, I'd like to go more in-depth into some of the economic analysis issues and the longer-term projections, the multipliers, and all of those things, so that we can have that kind of a discussion. And I think at that time, we'll also probably invite the CAO to talk about the larger budgetary contexts, and there will probably be other things that we'll want to add to that agenda too. But as I've said at the outset, we're going to continue to march forward on this, and we're going to take as many steps as we have to, as many hearings as we have to make sure that we are satisfied that we're taking the right course, that we're doing the best thing for our business community, best thing for our budget, and making those two things marry as well as we're capable of doing. So with that, thank you all very much. Thank you, colleagues. We're going to continue this matter to the next hearing. Thank you very much.